The fog still clung to the water, a spectral shroud over the glacial lake. October 26th, 2005, 5 years to the day. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine and impending snow. It was a mundane morning for Elias Thorne, a fisherman whose trawler, the Silent Current, cut a lonely furrow through the obsidian surface of Lake Lenore. He was checking his nets, a rhythm of existence that had defined his life for 40 years. The sun, a pale anemic disk, was just beginning its reluctant ascent over the jagged peaks of the Selkirk Mountains. Elias, a man carved from the same hard granite as the landscape he inhabited, had seen countless dawns break over this lake. He had seen its moods, its rages, its deceptive calm. But what he saw that morning was something entirely new, something that would unravel a meticulously woven narrative of disappearance and resurface a ghost, a dark mass, not a log, not a drift of reeds, bobbed gently near the shore, caught in a small eddy just north of the old logging camp. It was too regular, too defined. He steered the Silent Current closer, the diesel engine a low thrum against the vast silence. As he approached, the shape resolved itself. It was a kayak, a sea kayak, bright yellow, a startling splash of color against the muted greens and grays of the autumnal shore. It was, impossibly, almost pristine. No significant gouges, no obvious signs of distress, but it was empty, utterly, unnervingly empty. Elias, a man of few words and profound observations, knew instantly that this was no ordinary flotsam. The kayak was of a specific design, built for open water for long voyages, not for the recreational puttering of day trippers. He circled it slowly, the low sun glinting off its smooth, unblemished hull. Then he saw the attachment, a small waterproof case secured with heavy-duty straps to the stern. It was a pelican case, the kind professionals use to protect sensitive equipment. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. This was not merely lost property. This was an artifact, a silent pronouncement from a past that had refused to stay buried. He carefully maneuvered his boat, snagging the kayak with a gaff hook. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty kayak should be. The weight suggested contents. It suggested a story. He towed it back to his small, weathered dock, the yellow vessel trailing behind his trawler like a reluctant shadow. The local sheriff, Dale Peterson, arrived an hour later, his face a mask of weary recognition. Peterson had been the lead investigator on the cold case of Elias Thorne. No relation to Elias, but the name echoed through the valley, a persistent whisper of the unexplainable. Elias Thorne. Vanished. October 26th, 2000. 5 years ago to this very morning, she had set out from this very lake, intending a multi-day solo expedition through the remote waterways of the Selkirks. An experienced kayaker, a wilderness survival instructor, a woman meticulously prepared for any eventuality. Her disappearance had been a textbook example of the void. No distress call, no wreckage, no body, just the abrupt, inexplicable cessation of a life. Peterson approached the kayak with a reverence born of long-held frustration. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth hull, a silent acknowledgement of the years that had passed. The pelican case was indeed sealed, its clasps secured. There was a sense of profound irony here. Elias Thorne, the expert victim, whose greatest strength, her meticulous preparedness, had in the end proven to be her most haunting legacy. She had left no trace then, and now she had returned, not in person but in a vessel pregnant with secrets. The case was carefully transported to the provincial police lab in Nelson. The forensic team, accustomed to the grim realities of their work, approached this discovery with a heightened sense of intrigue. This was not a routine recovery. This was the opening of a time capsule. At 11:37 a.m. on October 26, 2005, lead forensic technician Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a razor-sharp intellect, began the documentation. She noted the kayak's make and model, a Wilderness Systems Tsunami 145, a robust touring kayak favored by seasoned adventurers. The serial number matched the registration records for Amelia Thorne's vanished vessel. Confirmation, this was undeniably hers. The straps securing the Pelican case were noted for their professional-grade quality, showing minimal degradation despite 5 years submerged or exposed to the elements. The case itself, once carefully opened, revealed its extraordinary contents: a high-definition digital camcorder, a satellite phone, a GPS unit, and a collection of spare batteries, all meticulously sealed in individual waterproof bags. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and carefully removed. The camcorder, a model considered state-of-the-art in 2000, was the focal point. It contained a 30-gigabyte hard drive, a veritable trove of potential information. The anticipation in the lab was palpable, a quiet hum beneath the clinical precision. This was more than just evidence. This was a voice from the grave. Dr. Reed initiated the forensic imaging process. The hard drive was carefully extracted and connected to a specialized workstation. The data recovery process began, a slow, painstaking operation designed to preserve every byte of information. The hours ticked by, marked by the soft whir of the computer and the occasional murmured technical term. The team worked in silence, a collective breath held. The first data stream confirmed the camcorder's functionality. A wave of quiet exultation passed through the lab. This was not a dead end. This was a beginning. The footage was recovered, timestamp by timestamp. It presented a fragmented yet increasingly coherent narrative. The first recorded entry was dated October the 25th, 6:15 a.m., the day before her disappearance. Amelia Thorne, alive, prepared, documenting her journey. The rule of irony began to assert itself almost immediately. Amelia Thorne's meticulousness, her devotion to preparation and documentation, had ironically become the mechanism for her eventual posthumous testimony. Her very intention to record her wilderness adventure had inadvertently created a detailed forensic log of her final hours. The initial footage was serene, almost idyllic. Amelia, a woman in her late 30s with keen, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke directly to the camera. Her voice was steady, calm, even cheerful. She detailed her route, her equipment, her contingency plans. "Forecast is clear for the next 3 days," she stated at 6:20 a.m., a slight smile playing on her lips. "Lake Lenore, up the Cascade River, portage around the rapids, then into the upper tarns, should be stunning." She listed the contents of her emergency kit: a medical pack, fire starters, water purification tablets, a signal mirror. The evidence log, a staple device in forensic storytelling, was being created by the victim herself, unwittingly. The camcorder became a silent companion, recording not just the beauty of the landscape but the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere. The lake, initially calm, began to show a subtle choppiness. The sky, once clear, became bruised with distant, high-altitude clouds. These were not immediate threats, merely subtle alterations in the fabric of the day, but in retrospect, viewed through the lens of tragedy, they gained a sinister weight. The camera continued to record intermittently throughout the 25th. Shots of Amelia paddling, her strokes strong and rhythmic. Shots of the shoreline, the ancient cedars towering over the water. Close-ups of her camp, a small, meticulously organized haven on a rocky outcrop. She was clearly in her element, an expert navigating a beloved wilderness. There was no hint of danger, no premonition, just the quiet confidence of a seasoned explorer. The last entry on October 25th was at 7:12 p.m. Amelia was cooking a dehydrated meal over a small portable stove. She looked tired but content. "Making good time," she murmured to the camera, stirring her meal. "Stars are starting to come out. Looks like a cold night." She smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. Another perfect day in the office. The screen then went dark, a silent punctuation mark at the end of a seemingly ordinary day. The next morning, October 26th, 2000, the day she vanished. The footage resumed at 6:48 a.m. The first thing immediately noticeable was the change in light. It was darker than it should have been at that hour. The air on the recording seemed thick, heavy. The camera panned slowly across the lake. The fog from Elias Thorne's discovery 5 years later was clearly visible, a dense, oppressive blanket hugging the water. It was a visual cue, a slow pan over the weathered atmospheric elements that were the silent witnesses to the unfolding event. Amelia's voice was still calm, but there was a subtle shift in her tone, a slight edge of concern. "Fog rolled in thick overnight," she stated. "Visibility is maybe 50 feet, not ideal for navigating." She then consulted her GPS unit, the small screen glowing faintly in the dim light. GPS holding steady, still tracking, no drift. Going to hold here for a bit, wait for it to burn off. A macro shot of the GPS screen, numbers flickering, confirming her location. The detail was chilling in its ordinariness. At 7:31 a.m., she decided to pack up camp despite the fog. "Can't just sit here all day," she reasoned, her voice still steady, betraying no panic. "I know this area well. I'll stick close to the shoreline, use my compass and map for triangulation." The camera showed her dismantling her tent, packing her gear. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, the meticulousness of the expert, the irony deepening with every frame. The footage from 8:05 a.m. was particularly unsettling. Amelia was back in her kayak, paddling slowly, cautiously through the dense fog. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic dip of her paddle and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. There was a sense of claustrophobia, the world reduced to a small, isolated sphere around her. "Still no visibility," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Feels strange. The air, it's too still." Then a subtle anomaly. The GPS unit, visible in the bottom right corner of the frame, began to show a slight drift. Not a dramatic jump, but a slow, almost imperceptible deviation from her intended course. GPS drift, a common phenomenon in remote areas, usually attributed to atmospheric interference or satellite triangulation errors. But Amelia, ever the expert, noted it immediately. "Huh," she murmured. "GPS is playing up, showing me slightly off course. Must be the fog messing with the signal." She then pulled out a physical map, unfolded it, and began to consult it with her compass. The digital and the analog, two forms of navigation, one failing, the other providing a comforting, if ultimately misleading, sense of control. At 8:19 a.m., a distinct, almost guttural sound could be heard. A low thrum, deep and resonant, seemed to emanate from the very air around her. Amelia paused, her paddle suspended in midair, her eyes, wide with a sudden, uncharacteristic flicker of unease, darted around the swirling mist. "What was that?" she breathed. "Did you hear that?" The camera strapped to the deck of her kayak captured her shifting posture, her head cocked, listening intently. The sound was not repeated. The fog remained thick, impenetrable. But the silence that followed was different. It was not serene. It was expectant. The next few minutes of footage from 8:20 a.m. to 8:28 a.m. were dominated by an increasing sense of disorientation. Amelia was clearly struggling to maintain her bearings. She repeatedly consulted her compass and map, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The current feels off," she stated, her voice tighter now. "I should be moving east, but I'm feeling a pull to the north." The camera showed her paddling harder, trying to correct her course. The lake, which had once been her familiar domain, was becoming alien, unpredictable. At 8:32 a.m., she made a critical decision. "I'm going to pull over," she announced, her voice firm, attempting to reassert control. "Find a suitable landing, wait this out. No point pushing it." She began to angle her kayak towards what she believed was the shoreline. The camera, still fixed, showed only the endless swirling gray of the fog. Then a sudden jolt. The kayak shuddered violently. Amelia cried out, a sharp, startled sound. The camera lurched, the image blurring wildly. It was as if something immense had struck the kayak from beneath, or perhaps she had hit a submerged object with incredible force. The sound was not a collision with rock or wood. It was a dull, heavy impact, followed by a metallic screech that seemed to vibrate through the water itself. The footage from 8:33 a.m. to 8:35 a.m. was chaotic. The camera, now partially submerged, showed only a distorted, bubbling view of the water. Amelia's shouts were muffled, panicked. There were sounds of splashing, frantic movement. Then a chilling silence. The bubbling subsided. The camera, still recording, showed only the murky, indistinct depths of the lake, an occasional ripple on the surface. No signal, no trace, just silence. At 8:36 a.m., the camera went dark. The hard drive stopped recording. The void. For 5 years, that had been the end of the story. A woman vanished, a kayak lost, a cold case. But now, with the meticulous forensic reveal, the narrative truth was beginning to emerge. The static-filled archival footage of the initial search parties, juxtaposed against Amelia's final moments, created a haunting rhetorical echo. The mountains don't explain why. The mountains keep their secrets. But Amelia Thorne, in her meticulous expertise, had left a breadcrumb trail, a digital testament to her final, inexplicable moments. The open-loop question hung heavy in the air. Why would something strike her kayak with such force? Why was there no debris, no trace? And why did the footage end so abruptly, so completely, just as the chaos began? The initial discovery was merely the opening act. The true mystery, encoded in 30 gigabytes of data, was only just beginning to unfold. The forensic imaging process at the Nelson Police Lab reached completion at 2:14 p.m. on October 27, 2005. Dr. Reed stared at the monitor, the blue light reflecting in her tired eyes. The 30 gigabytes of data were not merely a collection of video files. They were a digital anatomy of a disaster. The first batch of files, which ended in the abrupt darkness of 8:36 a.m. on the day of the disappearance, represented only a fraction of the data. The investigators' obsession began here in the cold light of the server room. Metadata, GPS drift logs, thermal sensor snapshots. The physical evidence was the kayak, but the narrative truth lay in the bits and bytes that followed the supposed end. Dr. Reed initiated a deep sector scan of the remaining 22 gigabytes. What she found defied the established timeline. The camera had not died, it had rebooted. At 9:12 a.m., October 26, 2000, the device began recording again, but the visual was gone. The lens was obstructed, likely by the internal housing of the Pelican case or a heavy layer of silt. What remained was the audio, a low rhythmic scraping. Sound traveled differently through the hull of a submerged vessel. It was forensic casual. The technicians described it as a structural moan. It was the sound of the yellow kayak being dragged, not by current, not by wind. The movement was directional, purposeful. It was being pulled across a grit-heavy surface, perhaps the lakebed, or perhaps something more artificial. The GPS metadata during this period showed a terrifying anomaly. While the kayak moved, the coordinates remained fixed. This suggested a signal shielding so absolute it could only be subterranean or deep underwater. Imagine you are standing on that summit, looking down at the placid blue of Lake Lenore, unaware that beneath the surface a woman's life was being mathematically erased. The expert victim trope was never more apparent than in the logs recovered from the secondary partition of the hard drive. Amelia Thorne had a habit of keeping a digital diary. She had accessed the device's internal text log feature at 10:45 a.m. Her entries were short, declarative, and rhythmic. Pressure increasing, air is stale, I'm in the dark. The promptness of her survival instinct was chilling. She wasn't screaming, she was documenting. At 11:02 a.m. she wrote, "The kayak is intact, I am in a pocket, I can hear them." Why would she use the plural? Who were they in the middle of a glacial lake? The forensic team cross-referenced the lake's bathymetry, the study of the underwater floor. Lake Lenore had a maximum depth of 450 feet. At that depth, the pressure would have crushed the kayak like an aluminum can. Yet the metadata showed no such structural failure. The temperature sensors recorded a steady 22 degrees Celsius. This was impossible. The lake water in October hovered near freezing. The reconstruction of the narrative truth was starting to look less like a drowning and more like an abduction into a space that shouldn't exist. The grieving investigator, in this case the collective effort of the provincial police, began to look for the impossible discovery. They focused on the hull of the kayak. Under a macro lens, the yellow plastic revealed strange microscopic pitting. It wasn't rust. It wasn't organic decay. It was a form of localized thermal scarring, as if the kayak had been subjected to intense, targeted heat while submerged. The pacing of the investigation slowed as they reached the files from October 27, 2000. Amelia was still writing. "They aren't speaking, they are measuring. I am a specimen." The rule of irony. Her knowledge of physiology, her understanding of the human body's limits, told her she should be dead from oxygen deprivation, yet she was breathing. At 3:22 p.m., the audio file recorded a voice. It wasn't Amelia's. It was a synthesized flat tone, repeating a series of coordinates. These coordinates did not correspond to any location on Earth. They were astronomical. "Doctor, Reed's team spent weeks trying to decode the frequency. It was a burst transmission, a high-bandwidth signal compressed into milliseconds. Forensic storytelling often relies on the mundane to ground the fantastic, but here the mundane, the serial number of a kayak, the brand of a camera, was being used to validate a nightmare. The evidence log grew to include items that shouldn't have been in the kayak when it was recovered. A small, translucent shard of a material that defied chemical analysis. It was harder than diamond, yet lighter than air. It had been found wedged in the rudder assembly. When tested, it emitted a faint pulsing light in the ultraviolet spectrum. Why would they do this? The question echoed through the lab. If this was a recovery, why leave the evidence? If this was a crime, why leave the witnesses? The mountains keep their secrets, but this secret had been spat back out with surgical precision. By the time the investigators reached the 3rd gigabyte of data, the tone of Amelia's entries shifted. The reverent distance of the chronicler was broken. "I see the lake from below," she wrote at 9 p.m. on the 2nd day. "It looks like a lid, a blue lid on a black box." The fragmented emphasis of her writing began to mirror her deteriorating psychological state. Cold, dark, blue, lid, no out, no up. The investigators noted that the timestamp pacing was beginning to drift. The camera's internal clock was slowing down. For every hour that passed in the outside world, the device was only recording 45 minutes of data. This was a classic sign of gravitational time dilation, a concept that had no business being in a missing persons case in the Selkirk Mountains. The technical terms, metadata, GPS drift, forensic imaging, were becoming the only tools left to describe a reality that was rapidly dissolving. Imagine you are Amelia, trapped in a yellow plastic shell, watching the time on your camera crawl. You are a survival expert. You have enough water for 3 days. You have a thermal blanket. You have a signal mirror. But you are in a place where the sun never rises, and the signal mirror only reflects the abyss. The investigators looked at the macro shots of the dirt found in the kayak's footwells. It wasn't lake silt. It was a volcanic ash, chemically identical to the soil found on the plains of Mars. The forensic report was 400 pages long, yet it contained no answers, only more granular details of the impossible. At 2 a.m. on the 3rd day, the camera captured a visual. For 3 seconds, the lens was clear. The flashbulb transition of the infrared sensor illuminated a space of vast industrial proportions, ribbed walls of a dark, non-reflective material, pulsing veins of blue light, and in the center of the frame, the yellow kayak, looking like a toy in a cathedral of shadow. There was a figure standing near the stern. It was blurred, a smudge of movement against the static-filled archival footage of the machine's memory. It wasn't human. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its posture too rigid. It was holding a device over the pelican case. The open-loop question: was it repairing the gear or downloading the soul? The reconstruction of the narrative truth was becoming a chronicle of an encounter. The mountains don't explain why, but the recordings were starting to suggest a purpose. Amelia's final text entry was dated October 29th, 2000. The door is opening, the water is coming back, they are finished with me. The forensic team found no water damage in the camera's internal circuitry. The seals had held perfectly, but they did find something else. Inside the battery compartment, there was a small handwritten note on a piece of waterproof paper. It wasn't in the evidence log initially. It had been missed in the first 3 sweeps. It was tucked behind the lithium cell. It said, "Don't look for the body, look for the signal." The writing was undeniably Amelia's, but the ink was a type of pigment that wouldn't be invented until 2004. This was the rule of irony at its most cruel. Her attempt to communicate was a chronological impossibility. The grieving investigator, Peterson, sat in his office in Nelson, staring at the yellow kayak in the impound lot. It looked so ordinary. It was just plastic and nylon. But it carried 30 gigabytes of an alternate reality. He obsessed over the granular details, the way the moss grew on the seat, the specific rust pattern on the buckles. He was looking for justice through memory, but the memory was corrupted. He began to experience his own open-loop questions. Why was the kayak found 5 years to the day after she vanished? Why was it found exactly where she started? The lake was a closed system, yet the kayak had traveled through a geography that mapmakers couldn't see. The forensic casual language of the final report summarized it as a displaced recovery event. To the public, it was a tragedy. To the investigators, it was a warning. The third phase of the narrative structure, the reconstruction, was stalled. How do you reconstruct a truth that violates the laws of physics? You start with the timestamps. At 4 a.m., October 30th, 2000, the GPS unit recorded a single ping. It was at an altitude of 30,000 feet. 5 minutes later, it was back on the surface of Lake Lenore. The kayak had fallen from the sky or risen from the depths, or simply blinked back into existence. No signal, no trace, just silence. This silence lasted for 5 years. The camera sat in its waterproof case, its hard drive spinning in the dark, waiting for Elias Thorne's gaff hook. The slow pans over the weathered objects in the evidence locker, the paddle, the life jacket, the signal mirror, emphasized the hollow nature of human preparedness. We build tools to survive the world we know, but we are completely defenseless against the world we don't. The archival footage of the 2000 search showed helicopters and divers scouring the surface. They were looking for a body. They should have been looking for a frequency. The metadata analysis showed that during the 5-year gap, the camcorder's battery had never depleted. It had remained at a constant 98% charge, energy from the void. The tech team at Nelson eventually stopped trying to explain it. They just documented it. They became chroniclers of the impossible. The visual cue prompts for the documentary essayist would include macro shots of the camera's lens, the glass reflecting the fluorescent lights of the lab, a cold, unblinking eye that had seen the ribbed walls and the blue light. The pacing of the story mimics the passage of time in the evidence. We are now in the 5th year of the silence. The impossible discovery has been made, but the narrative truth is a jagged thing. It doesn't fit into the file folders. It doesn't satisfy the grieving family. It only creates a haunting and melancholic sense of justice through memory. We remember Amelia Thorne not as a victim of the lake, but as an unwilling explorer of the beyond. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they let a piece of the secret drift back to shore. The forensic team began to notice a pattern in the static of the recordings. If you slowed the audio down by 400%, the structural moans became a voice. It was Amelia. She was screaming, but the sound was being processed, digitized, stripped of its emotion. It was forensic casual horror. "I am here," the voice said over and over. "I am here, I am here." But where was here? The GPS coordinates on the screen read 00, the center of the world, the point where all lines meet. The expert victim had been taken to the source, and then at 5:12 a.m. on the day of the discovery, the camera recorded its final metadata entry. Target returned, evidence planted. The investigators stared at the word planted. It implied a gardener. It implied an intent. The lake wasn't a graveyard. It was a petri dish. And the yellow kayak was the most successful culture they had grown. The 8,000-word script was a monument to this realization. It was a slow-burn descent into the fact that our reality is a thin membrane, easily pierced by a yellow kayak and a 30-gigabyte hard drive. The rhetorical echoes of the wind through the pines outside the lab seemed to mock the investigators. Why would they do this? The mountains don't explain why. The mountains keep their secrets. But the secrets were now on a hard drive, sitting in a plastic case, in a small town in British Columbia. The grieving investigator, Peterson, resigned a month later. He couldn't look at the water anymore. He saw the blue lid every time he closed his eyes. He saw the expert victim writing in the dark, documenting her own erasure. The reconstruction was over. The truth was not a narrative. It was a forensic image of a nightmare. The final visual of the second batch would be a macro shot of the camera's power light, a steady, unblinking green, a sign of life from a dead woman's tool. Imagine you are standing on that dock watching the yellow kayak bob in the water. You think you are looking at a tragedy. You are actually looking at a message, and the message is still being decoded. The forensic team had only just scratched the surface of the first 10 gigabytes. There were 20 more to go, 20 more gigabytes of the ribbed walls, the blue light, and the flat synthesized voice of the coordinates. The pacing would only get slower, the details would only get more granular, the horror would only get more clinical. This was the justice of memory, a cold, hard digital record of a life that was no longer ours to understand. The first batch ended with the discovery. The second batch ends with the realization that the discovery was intentional. We are being told something. We are being shown the ribbed walls through the eyes of a survival instructor who did everything right and still lost. The rule of irony is absolute. Her preparation made the data better. Her skill made the recording clearer. Her life was the price of the perfect forensic log. The forensic team's focus shifted from the what to the where during the third phase of the analysis, beginning at 9 a.m. on November 4, 2005. The reconstruction was no longer about the lake, it was about the vacuum. Dr. Reed's team began to dissect the GPS metadata from the final gigabytes with a level of granularity that bordered on the obsessive. In a typical case of GPS drift, the coordinates might bounce within a few meters due to multipath interference, signals bouncing off cliffs or water. But the data from Amelia's kayak didn't bounce. It moved with a mathematical perfection that suggested the device was being transported through a vacuum-sealed environment. At 11:42 p.m. on the third night of her disappearance, the GPS log recorded a series of ghost waypoints. These were coordinates that placed the kayak simultaneously in the Selkirk Mountains and in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Forensic casual explanation, a superposition of telemetry. To the grieving investigator, it was evidence that Amelia had been taken somewhere that occupied two places at once. The expert victim's logs continued to provide the anchor for this impossible narrative. "I can see the stars," she wrote at 2:15 a.m. on October 30th. "But they aren't the stars I know. They don't twinkle. They are just cold, hard points of white." Imagine you are Amelia, a survivalist who taught her students to navigate by the North Star, looking up to find the sky has been rearranged. The rule of irony, her greatest tool for orientation, had become the ultimate proof of her displacement. The evidence log was updated to include the thermal imaging sensor data from the camcorder's internal diagnostics. In 2000, these sensors were rudimentary, meant only to prevent the hardware from overheating. However, the metadata revealed that the external temperature outside the Pelican case had dropped to absolute zero for exactly 4 minutes, followed by a spike to 300 degrees. The kayak and the woman inside it should have been vaporized. Yet the macro shots of the yellow plastic showed only the microscopic pitting. No melting, no warping. Just the silent, permanent record of a thermal impossibility. The pacing of the investigation slowed to a crawl as the team reached the corrupted sector of the hard drive, roughly 8 gigabytes of data that appeared to be white noise. Dr. Reed, however, refused to classify it as such. She used a forensic imaging technique called bitstream frequency analysis. By visualizing the noise, she found a hidden layer of high-definition imagery. These were the slow pans over weathered objects that didn't belong to Amelia. They were images of artifacts from other disappearances: a watch from a hiker lost in 1974, a wedding ring from a boater who vanished in 1992, a compass from 1958. All of them were sitting on the same ribbed dark shelving as Amelia's kayak. Why would they do this? The open-loop question now extended beyond Amelia to a decades-long collection process. The mountains keep their secrets, but they were starting to look like a warehouse. The rhetorical echoes of the expert victim were heard in the audio files from the fourth day. Amelia's breathing was shallow, rhythmic, and incredibly calm. "The oxygen isn't running out," she whispered at 5:10 a.m. "It's being recycled. I can smell the ozone." Ozone, often associated with high-voltage electrical discharges or atmospheric ionization. The technical terms were the only way to ground the horror. The grieving investigator Peterson began to cross-reference the ozone sightings in the valley over the last 50 years. Every spike in atmospheric ozone corresponded with a missing persons report. This was the narrative truth being reconstructed through a slow-burn procedural. It wasn't one tragedy, it was a single continuous operation. The visual cues for this section would be the flashbulb transitions for time-stamped photos of the other victims' belongings, flickering on the screen like a digital wake. At 8 p.m. on October 30th, the metadata recorded a systemic reset. The camera, the GPS, and the satellite phone were all simultaneously reformatted, but the data wasn't erased, it was compressed. This is why 30 gigabytes could hold 5 years of silence. The device wasn't just recording Amelia, it was recording the passage of time itself. The forensic team found a file titled bio_log_THORNE_A. It was a biometric scan of Amelia's vitals, recorded by the camera's infrared heat-seeking array. It showed her heart rate, her pupil dilation, and her neural activity. The data showed that at 10:14 p.m., her brain activity reached a state of hypercoherence, a level of focus impossible for a human in a state of terror. She wasn't a victim anymore, she was being upgraded. The rule of irony. The woman who valued her independence was being integrated into a system she couldn't comprehend. The mountains don't explain why, but the biolog suggested a harvest. Imagine you are standing in that lab looking at the neural map of a woman who has been dead for 5 years, but whose brain was functioning at 400% capacity at the moment of her erasure. The emotional tone of the script remains haunting and melancholic, balancing the forensic coldness with the weight of Amelia's lost humanity. The evidence log now included the impossible ink note found in the battery compartment. Chemical analysis of the pigment showed it was a ferrofluid-based substance, sensitive to magnetic fields. When a magnet was moved over the note, the letters rearranged themselves. "Don't look for the body" became "I am the signal." The fragmented emphasis of the note, "no signal, no trace, just silence," was a lie. There was a signal. It was just waiting for the right receiver. The third batch of 2,000 words ends with the forensic team realizing that the silent current that Elias Thorne navigated was more than just a name for a boat. It was the mechanism of the lake itself. The 30 gigabytes of recordings were not a record of a death, but a manual for an arrival. The open loop remains: if Amelia is the signal, who is the broadcaster? The forensic analysis reached its terminal phase on December 12, 2005. The reconstruction was no longer a matter of law enforcement, but a matter of existential physics. Dr. Reed's final report, classified under provincial security protocols, focused on the last 4 gigabytes of data, the narrative truth that had been buried under layers of encrypted metadata. At 4:02 a.m. on what should have been October 31, 2000, the camcorder's audio captured a sound that the forensic casual linguists called the reciprocal. It was Amelia's voice, but it was layered over itself thousands of times, creating a choral effect that vibrated at a frequency capable of shattering glass. "I am not returning," the chorus whispered. "I am being distributed." The rule of irony. The survivalist who fought so hard to keep her physical form intact was now celebrating its dissolution. The grieving investigator, Peterson, sat in the dark of the evidence locker listening to the file. He realized that the yellow kayak wasn't a lifeboat, it was a delivery system. The impossible discovery wasn't that Amelia had been found, but that she had been sent back as data. The evidence log was closed with the final item, a 1.2-second video clip recovered from the hard drive's slack space. It showed the surface of Lake Lenore from an impossible perspective, looking up from the floor but through a lens that saw through the water, through the rock, and into the thermal signatures of the people standing on the shore. It saw Elias Thorne's boat 5 years before he arrived. It saw the search parties. It saw the future. Imagine you are standing on that shoreline today. The water is still. The mountains are silent. You feel a sense of peace, a sense of justice through memory, because the kayak was found. But the forensic image tells a different story. It tells us that the expert victim didn't vanish into a void, she vanished into a presence. The technical terms, GPS drift, metadata, thermal imaging, were just the primitive tools we use to measure a god. At 5:15 a.m., 5 years to the second after she first entered the fog, the camcorder recorded its final packet of data. It wasn't a video, it was a broadcast command. The satellite phone, which had been dead for half a decade, suddenly pulsed with a signal that bypassed every tower on Earth, beaming directly into the deep space coordinates found in the audio logs. Why would they do this? Perhaps the mountains don't keep secrets. Perhaps they are just waiting for the right bandwidth to tell them. The moral warning is clear. Preparedness is a lullaby we sing to ourselves in the dark. We pack our Pelican cases and check our GPS units, believing that information is a shield. But Amelia Thorne did everything right, and her reward was to become the very thing she feared, a signal in the silence. The chronicle of her disappearance ends here, not with a body, but with a realization. The lake is not a place, it is a transition. The yellow kayak, now a permanent exhibit in the forensic lab, remains a silent, weathered object, its yellow plastic a testament to a journey that had no destination, no signal, no trace, just the frequency. The mountains don't explain why. They simply remain watching the water, waiting for the next expert to step into the fog. In the end, the truth is not a story we tell. It is a signal we eventually become.